Hello there and welcome back to Writing from Scratch with me, Tom. On today's video, I want to talk about a really important element of storytelling, which are stakes. Let's start by defining exactly what stakes are. Within a story, stakes are the potential consequences or the actual fallout of the actions that our characters take. Or they can also be the potential repercussions that could happen if our character fails. Within a story, stakes can take many forms. They could be physical harm caused to the characters or actors within a story. They could be emotional trauma suffered on behalf of the characters. They could even be bigger things like world-ending apocalypses, or really small things like losing an item. Ultimately, the power of stakes depends on the purpose of the story and the narrative being followed. It depends on the character's motivations. But big stakes or small stakes, none of them are any less important than the other, and we need to make sure that we have good, convincing stakes within our story. So let's narrow down that definition a little bit and discuss exactly what we mean when we're talking about stakes, but also what we don't mean when referring to them. Let's get started.
We've discussed why consequences are important to stories before, but let's make sure we separate the two terms as they are slightly different. Consequences are what happened to the character or the situation or the location after the fact. Stakes are what the character puts at risk in order to undertake the task. Stakes create tension and motivate our character, and unlike consequences, they always need to be established early in the story to create said tension. Consequences don't necessarily need to be forewarned. Without stakes, a story can feel flat and uninteresting. Imagine reading a book where the protagonist puts nothing at risk and their failure doesn't mean anything. There's no tension or urgency, and no reason to care about what happens in the end. But with stakes, especially high stakes, the reader will be invested in the story and want to see the outcome.
So, how can we incorporate stakes into our narrative? Let's explore that a little bit further.
Well, first, we have to make the stakes high and personal to the characters. The more a character has to lose, the more invested the reader will be in the story. And the more personal it is, the more the character will care, and therefore the more the reader will care. Secondly, as mentioned earlier, stakes need to be communicated to the reader. If the reader doesn't know what is at risk, they won't understand why the narrative is unfolding, or why they should care about what happens. It's also not enough to just tell, as we know, but you need to show your reader how the character acts and reacts to achieve their goal. This will sell our reader on how seriously they should take this journey. Finally, we should understand that stakes are not solid. They should shift and increase as the story progresses. New obstacles, increased consequences, failure or controversial decisions taken by the protagonist all serve to increase the stakes of the story. The further through the gauntlet a character goes, the more tension will build, especially if the journey is becoming increasingly hard on them. By taking extra controversial decisions, we place the stakes on an even higher pedestal. We highlight the fact that these decisions are controversial and difficult for our character, and therefore failure is becoming less of an option. And if failure does occur, then the consequences for the character are likely to be severe.
So that's all well and good of what we should be doing in order to introduce stakes. But also, let's look at what we need to avoid when introducing them to make sure our story is convincing and, most importantly, not contrived.
The first is about making the stakes proportional to the story, the setting, and the ability of the characters. The stakes within Pride and Prejudice shouldn't be that if Lizzie and Mr. Darcy don't fall in love, the world will end. It should be that they will both be miserable otherwise. Similarly, Harry Potter stakes aren't that Voldemort being successful would cause Harry to fail his exams. It's that he will oppress thousands of wizards. Make sure the stakes are high, but only in relation to the story. And this is where context is going to be really, really important. Make sure you understand the context of the story, the motivations of your characters, and the likely consequences that will happen if they fail to reach those goals. By doing this, you can make sure that your stakes are proportional to what's at risk and to the character's motivations and goals. A second point here, and connected to proportionality, is to make sure that you don't make your stakes meaningless. This might sound obvious, and your characters might care about the consequences, but they have to be meaningful enough for the reader to care too. It reminds me a lot of recent Marvel movies, where the stakes are that the quantum realm will be destroyed or time will end. I just don't care, because it's so meaningless that I can't get attached, no matter how much the actors do their best to sell the idea. This doesn't mean you can't be creative and imaginative. Lord of the Rings stakes are that a Dark Lord will wipe out all civilized life, but the reader cares because we could see this happening within the setting of Lord of the Rings. In Marvel, it's supposed to be set in the real world, therefore we understand that it's very unlikely time will end. If Lord of the Rings was set in the 21st century Britain, it would be certainly less effective to believe that the Dark Lord would be wiping things out anytime soon. A final point is not to forget about the stakes for the other characters involved too, especially if they are smaller characters who could be easily overlooked. Try and think about what the stakes are for the secondary protagonists. What about the antagonists? What about the innocent bystanders? Building these up as a writer will increase the importance of the narrative. Remember that your primary character is not the only person involved in your story, so establishing the meaning of the stakes for everybody involved will create a richer, deeper, and more interesting story for your reader.
So, the next time you're watching a movie or reading a book, pay attention to the stakes within the story and notice how they create a sense of tension for the characters and the narrative. Or notice when there's no tension because maybe there's a lack of stakes. At the end of the day, you need to remember that the stakes within your story are ultimately what make your story worth telling. So, thank you very much for joining me on today's video, and I hope you go away having a better idea of what stakes are and how you can implement them successfully within your own story. If you've enjoyed today's video, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing the video with your friends, and otherwise I'll see you all next week. Thank you very much.